Hello and welcome to Introduction to Programming in Python. Thanks for sticking with us. In this video, we are going to explore functions and how we can use them to improve our code. Now, when I'm saying functions, you're probably thinking about math and getting a little uncomfortable, because you're thinking of a chart and you're thinking of, f of x equals y, and you're remembering all of those horrible middle school experiences where you're trying to learn algebra and it's really hard. But when we say functions in computer science, we're actually a bit more general and we're definitely more flexible than the math definition that you're probably used to. When we're talking about functions, we're going to talk about some sort of box that takes an input and produces an output. We often use the phrase black box because we can't see into the function most of the time. If you had a black box in your desk and you put in the number 5 at the top and the number 15 spat out, and then you put the number 3 in the top and the number 9 spat out, you'd eventually figure out that your box just multiplies whatever you put in by 3, but you don't really care how it does that. And a lot of times we're going to see functions that are really powerful, like a function that just gets all the user input or processes some database transaction. And we really aren't going to want to focus on how each step inside of that function happens. We're instead going to want to build functions on top of functions on top of functions to make our understanding of the problem more conceptual. Now, if that sounds kind of imposing, don't worry. We're going to start really, really simple. And in fact, we've already used functions a lot. We've used the print function to put something on the screen, but we don't really care how it's putting something to the screen. Same thing goes for taking user input. We don't care how the input function is going to bring keystrokes from a keyboard somewhere into our program. And the same thing goes for for loops, where we have a range function. So I said we were starting simple. We definitely are. This is the add function. I wrote it a second ago, and all it does is add two numbers together. Really, this is a fancy way to write plus, but it's going to teach us all of the components of a function and how we might be able to write a more complicated one later. Now we start with the def keyword. Def is short for define, and we're defining a function, so it makes sense to start with that. The thing we're defining, we name right after the def keyword, and idle is going to turn it blue. So here we're defining the add function. And after the name of the function, you need to have two parentheses, no matter what, even if there's nothing inside of them. But typically, we're going to put a comma-separated list of variable names. Now, these are the inputs that we're going to add together. So num1 and num2 in this example are going to become values based on how we're using add later. Now, if you remember our loop video, you'll remember the colon indent syntax. At the end of our function name and at the end of the parameters, we're going to put a colon and a bunch of code that's indented. And as long as we have indented code, we're telling Python that that indented code corresponds to this add function. At the end of the function, we're going to type return. Now, return doesn't need to be the last line of the function, but return is going to exit out of this function and result in whatever we're returning. We're going to see a more in-depth example in a second, but the add function is going to return number 1 plus number 2, and it does what you would hope it does. Now, this more complicated example I said a second ago is going to be about factorials. If you're talking to a mathematician and you're really excited about the number n, you'll type n exclamation point, but that mathematician will get confused because they think you mean n factorial, which would be n times n minus 1 times n minus 2, so on and so forth. The code for this is pretty straightforward. I'll give you a second to look at it. We're writing a factorial function. It takes in a number. We're calling that number n. And we're going to multiply it by the result value and then subtract 1 from n each time we do so. So this will multiply it by n, subtract 1 from n, and multiply it by n minus 1, so on and so forth, eventually resulting in the result value. So how would we use this in a program? Well, here's a, 10-line program that writes the first 10 factorials onto the screen. The red arrow I'm drawing here is the line that Python is looking at while we run the code. The first thing we do is tell Python, whoop-de-doo, we've got a factorial function, and it skips through it, it saves all that, and understands that when we ask for a factorial later, it knows where to go. Next, we print the first 10 factorials on the screen. And by that I mean the literal string. And then we go into the for loop. I becomes 0 because we're looping through a range from 0 to 9. And I've replaced all of the instances of the variable name I with a 0. We come down to the print function, and we're printing out 0 and the factorial of 0. We don't know what the factorial of 0 is yet, so we're going to pause here and jump to the function definition that we've defined earlier. Now we're asking for the factorial of 0, so we take that 0 and we put it in everywhere we saw n in the factorial function. And we start running this code instead. So we look at result, we put 1 in the result variable, and we go through, and eventually we return the value 1. Now, in the print function down here, we previously wrote factorial of 0, but conceptually we're just going to erase that and put in the value 1. So now this reads print 0 and 1, and that's exactly what gets put to the screen. And we're going to go through printing all 10 factorials, and you can see those outputs on the side. Hopefully this gives you a little bit of an idea of the control flow when you write a function. So why would you use these? Well, you never want to repeat yourself in programming because every time you write the same code, you introduce a chance to write a new bug. Functions also make your code easier to read. Instead of having to read the 10-line factorial code, you just see the word factorial and believe that it's going to work. So imagine we had a big, complicated program that interacted with a database and had 10,000 users, and somewhere within it we wanted to get user input, process their data, and visualize their results to some, businessman at a meeting. Well, getting user input might grow to be 100, 200, 500 lines. Processing user input probably requires some database calls and requires all this crap. And visualizing the results is a whole topic on its own where you're introducing an art department and you've got to figure out how to coordinate all those pieces. Wouldn't it be great if our code could be these 3 lines and we send each function to a different team and let them do that? Or if you're working alone, I don't want to think about processing user input. I'm just going to stay in the get user input function and work on that for a while. It really makes it so that you don't need to keep the whole program in your head at one time. Now I've introduced a lot of concepts right here, and we're going to take a break. In the next video, we're going to do a whole programming example where we get to see how we can use functions to their best abilities. So thanks for sticking with me so far. I hope you're as excited as I am to start writing some functions in Python, and I'll see you next week. If I eventually get to it next week, I guess. Yeah.